How are you? My name is Alan Crux. I have a master's degree in geography and a professor of geopolitics. Today we think about the impacts of closing the Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf and the short and medium-term impacts on this situation. A water corridor less than 50 kilometers wide. It's all that separates Persian Gulf oil from the rest of the world. And in recent weeks, this corridor has become the most dangerous spot on the planet. It's March 2026. Iran, in the Persian Gulf, announced the partial closure of the Strait of Hormuz and threatens to close it completely. On the other side, U.S. President Donald Trump gave the Iranian government a 48-hour ultimatum. Open the strait or the country's power plants will be destroyed. The deadline expires today. This is no ordinary crisis. We're not just talking about a dispute between two countries. We're talking about a maritime route through which around 20% of all the oil consumed on the planet passes, in addition to a large part of the liquefied natural gas that supplies Europe and Asia. If the Strait of Hormuz stops, the world stops together. But before we understand what is at stake today, we need to answer some essential questions. Why does Iran have this power over a route that does not belong to it alone? Who really benefits from closing the strait? And what does Trump intend to do when the deadline expires? In this video, we will take the report published today by CNN Brazil, Poder 360, and Isto, and use it as a starting point for a deeper analysis. We will explain what happened, show the historical context of this crisis that has been building for decades, analyze the real interests of each actor involved, and explore possible scenarios for the coming months. Because what appears to be an exchange of threats between Washington and Tehran could, in fact, be the beginning of a reconfiguration of the global energy and geopolitical balance. In Brazil, which imports oil, which depends on the dollar and which is part of this globalized economy, is not immune to what happens 12,000 kilometers away. Stay until the end. This video will change the way you see this conflict. Let's start with the facts, clearly separating what was reported from what is analytical interpretation. It all started with a series of events that intensified throughout March 2026. On March 2nd, an aide to the commander of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps publicly declared that the Strait of Hormuz was closed and that any ship that tried to pass through would be set on fire. The statement came directly from Iranian state media, IRIB. Before that, in February, the United States and Israel began a series of military strikes against Iran, amid growing tensions over Iran's nuclear program. The most impactful target was Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the country's supreme leader, killed in an Israeli attack. The death of the top leader was the trigger that dramatically accelerated the entire escalation. In response, the Iranian regime began retaliatory attacks against Middle Eastern countries that host American military bases. The United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, and Iraq were hit. The Revolutionary Guard launched the so-called Operation Promesa Veras 4, already in the 74th round of offensive as of today. On Saturday, March 21st, Trump issued an ultimatum via the Truth Social network. Iran would have 48 hours to completely reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Otherwise, the United States would attack and destroy the country's power plants, starting with the largest. The deadline expires this Monday, March 23, 2026, today. The Iranian response was immediate. Lieutenant Colonel Ebrahim Zolfikari, spokesman for Central Headquarters Qadam al-Anbiya, the operational command of the Iranian armed forces, declared that if the U.S. attacks Iran's power plants, the Strait of Hormuz will be completely closed and will not reopen until our destroyed plants have been rebuilt. Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf also threatened to irreversibly destroy all critical energy and oil infrastructure in the Middle East if the U.S. carried out the strikes. According to maritime analysis company CLER, Iran had already reduced vessel transit through the strait to around 5% of normal pre-conflict volume. In other words, partial closure was already a concrete reality even before the most recent threats. The difference now is that Tehran threatens to make this blockade total and indefinite. The impact is already being felt in global markets. Brent crude reached $112.91 per barrel, the highest level since July 2022. The World Trade Organization warned that if the war drags on for the rest of 2026, global economic growth could fall from 2.8% to 2.5%. At least 39 refineries, natural gas fields, and energy facilities in 9 countries have been damaged since the start of the conflict. Iran's representative to the International Maritime Organization stated that the strait remains open to international navigation except to enemies. Analytical interpretation. This careful formulation reveals something important. Iran does not want an unrestricted total blockade, which would also harm its own allies, such as China and Russia. The strategy is selective. Block Western ships while keeping the route functional for strategic partners. Interestingly, Tehran approved the passage of ships bound for China and other Asian countries. This is no accident. It is economic diplomacy disguised as war. Brad Cooper, head of U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, declared that Iran's ability to threaten freedom of navigation in the strait is reduced following the destruction of Iranian intelligence facilities and radars. This statement serves an American domestic narrative to show the American public that the conflict is being managed. But independent military officials warn that Iran still possesses ballistic missiles, drones, and naval mines with the capacity to turn the strait into a high-intensity war zone. The Trump administration has sent contradictory signals throughout the crisis. At the same time as it threatened to attack Iranian energy plants, the American government suspended sanctions on Iranian oil already loaded on ships, clearly to try to contain the rise in fuel prices in the United States. This reveals an internal tension in the White House between the policy of maximum pressure and the domestic economic consequences of a full escalation. Who reacted and from which side? Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have strengthened the defense of their energy infrastructures. Israel stated that it would personally attack all Iranian leaders. 22 countries have offered to contribute to the reopening of the strait, a sign that the international community recognizes the global nature of the crisis. China and Russia, in turn, adopted strategic silence, which in diplomacy amounts to a refusal to condemn Iran. Ultimately, what we have before us is not just a military conflict. It is an infrastructure war where the objective is not to conquer territory, but to turn off the opponent, whether by cutting electricity or blocking oil routes. And that completely changes the rules of the game. To understand why the Strait of Hormuz has this power over the world, we must first understand what it is. Geographically, it is a maritime canal about 330 kilometers long and only 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, which makes it technically easy to block. To the north is Iran, to the south, Oman, and between 17 and 21 million barrels of crude oil pass through the corridor every day, in addition to billions of cubic meters of liquefied natural gas. There is no alternative route with the same capacity. The IPSA pipeline, which passes through the territory of Saudi Arabia to the Red Sea, and the Habshan-Fajr pipeline in the United Arab Emirates, could divert part of the flow, but together they represent at most half of the volume that passes through Hormuz. A full-blown crisis in the Straits would literally be a global energy emergency with no short-term solution. The relationship between Iran and the United States did not begin in 2026. It has deep roots that date back to the Cold War, and that explain a lot about what we're seeing today. In 1953, the CIA and British MI6 organized the coup that overthrew Iran's democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized Iranian oil, contrary to Western interests. In Mossadegh's place, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, an ally of the United States, was reinstated. This intervention generated a historical wound that still fuels anti-American discourse in Tehran. In 1979, the Islamic Revolution overthrew the Shah and established the Islamic Republic led by Ayatollah Khomeini. The United States was declared the Great Satan. The American embassy in Tehran was seized, and 52 diplomats were held hostage for 444 days. Diplomatic relations were severed and never fully restored. During the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, the United States supported Saddam Hussein's Iraq, providing intelligence and weapons against Iran. The Strait of Hormuz was the scene of direct naval clashes during this period. The U.S. destroyed Iranian oil installations and sank Iranian Navy ships in the so-called Operation Mantis in 1988, the largest American naval combat since the Second World War. The Iranian nuclear issue is the other major axis of tension. Since the 1990s, Iran has been developing uranium enrichment capabilities, claiming peaceful purposes, while Western powers and Israel accuse the country of seeking nuclear weaponry. This lingering suspicion fueled decades of international sanctions, cyber attacks, such as the Stuxnet virus, blamed on the U.S. and Israel, which destroyed Iranian nuclear centrifuges in 2010 and targeted assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists. In 2015, the Vienna Nuclear Agreement, the so-called JCPOA, seemed to open a diplomatic window. Iran agreed to limit its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. But in 2018, Trump unilaterally withdrew the U.S. from the deal and reimposed even harsher sanctions. Iran responded by gradually exceeding the limits established by the agreement, advancing the production of enriched uranium and technically approaching the threshold necessary to build a bomb. Israel, which has never trusted diplomatic solutions to the Iranian nuclear problem, during this period conducted a campaign of sabotage and assassinations that culminated in the 2026 attacks. From the Israeli perspective, the window to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear capabilities was closing, and the Netanyahu government opted for direct military action. Iran has been threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz since the 1980s. In 1984, in the midst of the Iran-Iraq War, it began the so-called tanker wars, attacking oil ships from neutral countries to put pressure on Western powers. In 2011 and 2012, when Western sanctions were intensified, Tehran again threatened to close the strait, causing the price of oil to soar with just the verbal threat. In 2019, tension reached a new peak. Tankers were attacked in the Gulf of Oman. An American military drone was shot down. Then President Trump even ordered retaliatory strikes and canceled them 10 minutes before they were carried out. British ships were captured. The Revolutionary Guard captured a Swedish oil tanker. The world came closer to direct conflict than many people realized. What is new in 2026, therefore, is not the threat itself. It is the context. This time, there's a real war going on. Iran's supreme leader was killed. Iranian naval and air forces were partially destroyed. The country is under extreme pressure, and the strait is already partially closed in practice, not just as a rhetorical threat. The line between strategic bluff and effective action has never been thinner. To understand the magnitude of what could happen, it is worth comparing it with another historical moment in which a strategic maritime route was blocked. In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, triggering an international crisis that involved the United Kingdom, France, Israel, and, behind the scenes, the USA and the USSR. The blockade lasted months and accelerated the end of European colonialism in the Middle East, in addition to reconfiguring Cold War alliances. A blockade of Hormuz in 2026 would have a proportionally even greater impact, because the world's dependence on Persian Gulf oil is much more structural today than its dependence on the Suez Canal in 1956. And because the integration of global supply chains is much more complex and vulnerable. Strategic objective: prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear capabilities, maintain naval hegemony in the Persian Gulf, and guarantee free navigation in the Strait. Possible gain: a weakened Iran, without cohesive leadership, reduces the main medium-term threat to Israeli security and the American presence in the region. A clear military victory would also be domestically advantageous for Trump in a politically sensitive year. Risks: escalation could lead to a conflict the U.S. does not want to manage alone, with military casualties, skyrocketing fuel prices, and domestic economic instability. European allies are nervous, and China is watching every American step in the Gulf with interest, gauging American responsiveness while planning its own moves in Taiwan. It is worth noting the contradiction. The U.S. suspended sanctions on Iranian oil already loaded on ships to try to contain the rise in fuel prices. This reveals that Washington is playing with two conflicting goals at the same time, putting pressure on Iran and protecting the American economy. In geopolitics, conflicting objectives often produce incoherent policies. Strategic objective: survive as a regime, preserve what remains of its military capacity, and extract as many concessions as possible from an extremely fragile position. With Khamenei dead, its navy and air force degraded, and its power plants threatened, Iran is in no position to win a conventional conflict with the U.S. Possible gain: control over Hormuz is the last weighty pressure card. By threatening to close the strait and attack energy infrastructure throughout the region, Iran raises the cost of an American attack to a level that could deter even Trump. The logic is, they can destroy us, but the destruction will be very costly for the entire world. A total closure of Hormuz would also harm countries that are allies of Iran, such as China and India, which depend on this oil. This could isolate Tehran diplomatically at a time when it needs international support. Furthermore, Iran knows that a prolonged conflict in the Strait could justify a large-scale American naval intervention that definitively eliminates its ability to threaten the route. Strategic objective: permanently eliminate Iranian nuclear capabilities and dismantle the network of Iranian-backed groups, Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, that surround Israel on multiple fronts. Khamenei's death was the ultimate objective, accomplished. Now, Netanyahu wants to consolidate this strategic advantage before Iran reorganizes itself. Possible gain: a fragmented Iran, without consolidated leadership and without an active nuclear program, is the best security scenario that Israel could imagine in decades. From an Israeli perspective, the cost is acceptable, even if it means weeks of war, missiles falling on cities, and regional instability. Risks: Israeli public opinion is divided. More than 15 people were killed by Iranian missiles in Israel. The West Bank records victims. The conflict can last for months, and no long war is foreseeable. Furthermore, Israel needs the U.S. to remain committed, and Trump's signals about wanting to end the war without a clear solution over the strait have left Jerusalem worried. Strategic objective: China imports more than 40% of its oil from the Persian Gulf. A closure of Hormuz would be devastating for the Chinese economy. At the same time, every day of conflict between the U.S. and Iran is a day in which Washington is distracted and weakened in the Pacific, creating space for Beijing to advance on Taiwan, the South China Sea, and other fronts. Therefore, China plays a game of two simultaneous boards. It maintains diplomatic channels with Iran, and Tehran has allowed the passage of ships bound for China, while observing the erosion of American prestige. Beijing will not openly support Iran, but neither will it pressure it to give in. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. For Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha, the nightmare is the same. Their oil, gas, and water desalination infrastructures are just minutes away from Iranian missiles. They need American protection, but they do not want to be targets of Iranian retaliation. The position is extremely uncomfortable. Supporting the U.S. too much could provoke Iran. Retreating too far could lose American protection. Saudi Arabia has strengthened the defenses of its energy facilities. The United Arab Emirates has increased its state of alert. But none of these countries want all-out war in the region, because the economic cost would be devastating for them too. With Trump's deadline expiring today, March 23, 2026, there are multiple possible paths. Let's construct the most likely scenario based on the available data, recognizing, of course, that in geopolitics, the unpredictable is the rule. This is, in the assessment of many analysts, the most likely scenario in the coming months. The logic is simple. None of the main actors want an all-out war. The U.S. does not want a prolonged conflict that will drive down American stock prices and further raise the cost of living. Iran does not have the capacity to face a large-scale American offensive without being completely destroyed as a functioning state. And the Gulf countries, U.S. allies, are pushing behind the scenes for a way out that does not involve the destruction of all regional infrastructure. What's likely to happen? Trump maintains verbal pressure, but may pause attacks on Iranian power plants, as ISTO reported that the U.S. already signaled on March 23rd. Iran, on the other hand, partially reopens the strait to non-American vessels, maintaining selective control as negotiating leverage. Behind the scenes, a diplomatic round begins, mediated by neutral countries, possibly Oman, which has historically served as a conduit between Washington and Tehran, or Turkey, which is interested in positioning itself as a regional mediator. In the short term, over the next 3 to 6 months, this means high oil prices, but not at the catastrophic level of $150 or $200 per barrel. It means high-risk premiums on marine insurance, reduced cross-strait trade, and moderate to severe global inflationary pressure. In the medium term, 1 to 3 years, the conflict could be the catalyst for an acceleration in renewable energy and the diversification of oil routes. Importing countries such as Japan, South Korea, and India will seek to reduce their vulnerability to this type of shock. This could paradoxically accelerate the global energy transition, albeit for geopolitical rather than environmental reasons. Brazil is not in the Persian Gulf, but no country is immune to this crisis. Brazil is an oil exporter, which means that a more expensive barrel may seem, at first glance, to be good news. But there's another side. Brazil imports processed petroleum products. It imports fertilizers, which depend on natural gas from the Gulf. And the country's entire logistics and transport chain is sensitive to the cost of oil. Furthermore, a global energy shock depresses global economic growth. And when the world grows less, Brazil exports fewer commodities, receives less foreign investment, and sees the dollar strengthen against the real. The rally has already begun. The dollar has strengthened as a safe haven asset, and Asian and European markets have registered declines following threats of total closure. In the long term, the Hormuz scenario serves as a reminder to Brazil that energy security is a national strategic issue, not just a problem for others. The pre-salt was an important step in this direction, but the debate about domestic refining capacity Dependence on imports of derivatives and the diversification of the national energy matrix needs to leave universities and enter the political agenda permanently. There's a second scenario that deserves attention, not because it is the most likely, but because it is the most dangerous: the accident. In areas of high military tension, with multiple armed actors operating in confined spaces under extreme psychological pressure, the likelihood of an unintentional incident is much greater than in normal times. A missile launched at a wrong target, a tanker hit by a drone of uncertain origin, a fighter shot down due to mistaken identification. Each of these events could be enough to turn a controlled escalation into a full-blown conflict. History is full of wars that no one wanted to start, but which began due to accidents that neither party knew how to contain in time. The 2026 crisis has several elements that increase this risk. There are multiple military forces operating simultaneously in the same region: American, Israeli, Iranian, NATO. Communication channels between Washington and Tehran are extremely limited, and the information environment is full of disinformation and contradictory narratives. Let's recap what we looked at today. The Strait of Hormuz is, in practice, partially closed. Iran has reduced traffic to 5% of normal volume and threatens to shut down completely if the U.S. attacks its power plants. Trump gave a 48-hour deadline that expires today. The first signs are of an American tactical pause, but the crisis is far from resolved. Behind the immediate event lies a deeper crisis: decades of mistrust between Washington and Tehran, a nuclear program that has never been resolved diplomatically, the structural fragility of a global economy that still depends on a 21-mile sea route to function, and the gradual erosion of America's ability to act alone in the Middle East without paying rising domestic costs. What this episode reveals, more than anything, is that the world has not yet built a sufficiently decentralized energy system to withstand this type of shock. As long as 20% of global oil passes through a single 33-kilometer corridor, any crisis in that region will quickly turn into a crisis for everyone. Geopolitics is rarely about isolated events. It's about long-term strategic processes, which are often only understood years or decades after they happen. The closure of the Suez Canal in 1956 hastened the end of European imperialism. The 1973 oil crisis transformed global energy policy for decades. What we are seeing today in Hormuz could similarly be the beginning of a reconfiguration of the global energy and geopolitical balance, the full consequences of which are still being written. Will China use this crisis to advance its agenda in the Pacific? Will Gulf powers recalibrate their dependence on American protection? Will Europe accelerate its energy independence? Will Brazil make strategic decisions on refining and energy security? These are the questions that the coming years will answer. For now, we are left with the question that every honest geopolitical analysis needs to leave open. If you've made it this far, you understand that geopolitics isn't just for experts. It is for anyone who wants to understand why the price of fuel rises, why the dollar varies, why international news affect their daily lives. If this video helped you see the world in more depth, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell. Every week we bring analyses like this, without simplification, without sensationalism, with historical and strategic context.